Hello and welcome to the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society's Perspective series on CCPTV, the educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Freeman, Associate Professor in the Department of Social Science. We're fortunate to have a special guest today, Dr. Terry Madonna. Dr. Madonna is Director of the Center for Politics and Public Affairs at Franklin Marshall University, where he is also a Professor of Public Affairs and the Director of the Franklin Marshall College Poll. Dr. Madonna holds a Ph.D. in political history from the University of Delaware and is a frequent guest on radio and television discussing political issues and polling results. Welcome, Dr. Madonna, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Dave.
I had the good fortune of hearing your earlier speech, and I just wanted to start out with a mention of Pennsylvania. Is Pennsylvania still a swing state in your view?
Yeah, probably not. The president was a pretty easy victor 4 years ago, 10 percentage points. That was a substantial victory. The problem this year in terms of the swing state analogy is that in the average of the polls as we speak right now, the president has about an 8-point lead. We have 20 electoral votes, which makes us a very valued prize in the Electoral College sweepstakes. The problem is that with an 8-point lead, there are 9 other battleground states where either candidate's lead is less than 8 points. So the candidates are spending their time and their campaign resources elsewhere. As we speak, there's not a single television commercial being aired in Pennsylvania by either of the candidates or the super PACs. Now, I think in terms of statewide elections, we'll be competitive. The Republicans romped through the state 2 years ago. We've had alternating governors every 8 years. We have a U.S. senator from either party. So I think in terms of elections within Pennsylvania will be competitive, and we're going to have to wait and see how close this presidential election finally ends up to maybe make the final determination as to whether we're a swing state or not.
The determination how a candidate's doing through the use of the polls, one of the measures as to how the campaigns will spend their money in a particular state?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, and remember, we're doing public polls, and not arguably there's 15 to 17 out every 2 weeks, national polls. And the candidates are doing polls. And they're doing a lot more polling and a lot more targeting of differing demographic groups and regions. So they know where voters have decided. They know where voters are, where they're more undecided voters. They can. Now, we can do that to some extent. We can talk about the regions and the big demographics, but they're doing it every day, and they're doing it to a fare to well. So follow the money. If a race is close and a state is close, look for television and look for the candidates. The other indicator is where are they spending their own time. In Pennsylvania, for example, other than Governor Romney's recent visit here, we've not seen a presidential or vice presidential candidate since before the conventions. They're sending a lot of surrogates, you know, the president's family, the Governor Romney's family, and, you know, members of Congress from both parties who are in the state campaigning. But right at the moment, not a battleground state, and number two, follow the money. That'll tell you where the action is.
I hear a lot about polling. There must be many different types of polls. You have the Franklin Marshall poll.
Right.
Why don't you give us a brief idea what you do with that, and then let's contrast it to some other types.
At Franklin Marshall College, we use voter lists, randomly generate the names, live trained interviewers, and we do all the in-house analysis ourselves. We don't ship any of the product to a vendor, to an outside group. And I'm not suggesting that's wrong, I'm just suggesting that that's the way we do it. There are many other ways to do it. For example, there are automated polls. There are internet polls where they're using lists from the internet. We also all have to take into consideration cell phone inclusion. 30% of the households in this nation are cell phone only households. In Pennsylvania, because we have the 3rd largest senior population, we still have a fair number of homes that are landline only or reverse it, fewer number of people, residents who are cell phone only. We're maybe 21, 22%, but it's been growing exponentially. So look into the future. In 20 years, the young folks, they don't, the students, what's a landline? I don't even know if they would know what one is or how to find one, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. How would your poll differ, say, than a poll from one of the campaigns? Now, they have their own pollster on staff, I assume?
Yeah, they have their own polls and their own call center, and they're probably doing polls more frequently. We do one a month. But there are polls that are other polls done by the media that, you know, media outlets don't do polls themselves. Like I poll down here in Philadelphia for WPVI and the Philly Daily News and 6 other media outlets in the state. The Philadelphia Inquirer this year has done some polling. They've gone and hired a pollster to do it, a polling operation to do it. The campaigns themselves routinely are doing polls, and they're also doing something else. They do a lot of message testing. You know, if you knew A, about a candidate, would that make it more or less likely to vote for you? If you knew that candidate B had spent X amount of dollars doing something, or how about candidate C? Do you know if he had voted 5,000 times to raise your taxes? And then that message testing can be used for TV commercials. They'll do what we call focus groups and then quantitative work like polls to voters, and between the two of them, and they'll work out a process of doing that testing so they know when they run a commercial whether it's going to be effective or not. They're not just running commercials just because somebody sits in a chair like you and I are chatting and say, okay, oh gee, I think it'd be a good idea to talk about this aspect of the campaign, or something about what Governor Romney did or President Obama did. It's all very well tested in focus groups and in quantitative polls before it ends up on the magic of television.
Do the efforts to sample that way tend to drive the message? In other words, are many of the messages entirely focus group tested before they embark on it?
I think the big ones are. I don't think any campaigns or now I won't say that all super PACs are, and there may be some smaller organizations that are running commercials that aren't. But you're not going to spend, you know, you'll read of a media buy, you know, let's say a Romney super PAC decides it's spending $11 million in 9 battleground states without testing it. I don't think so. That's why very few of them sort of backfire. Now, some candidates that are running for Congress or state legislature might run commercials that aren't as tested as well, and sometimes they'll backfire. You have to be careful about personal, you know, how personal you can get or how harsh you can get. But I'll tell you something, we'll know for sure at the end of the day, but most early reports talking about 85 to 90% of the commercials being negative this year. Highest proportion of negative to positive commercials since television advertising began. There is a law of diminishing returns, but they work. And they're targeted to certain groups. That's the other point. Sometimes there are rally, get out the base commercials. Sometimes they're introductory, they're positive. Who is Mitt Romney? Who is Barack Obama? You have to do it for the president now, but Mitt Romney, introduce yourself, and then what are you likely to do if elected? Much less of those this year and more, he voted to raise your taxes, he will end Social Security, you know, debates, you know, over mostly negative subject matter.
Do you find that the polling every day, what sorts of things are they doing every day? Say in a candidate's polling operation, what sorts of things would they be looking at?
Well, they're first of all looking at the horse race numbers, meaning who's ahead. They're trying to find out what issues are motivating voters. You know, why is some movement one way or another in the polls? Why is someone gaining ground or losing ground? Then they want to know, as I mentioned a moment ago, what is it that will likely move voters? And again, they're targeting commercials to a certain group of voters. So sometimes they're to reinforce support among their own core supporters if they feel that's shaky. One of the things that the Romney people, I think, feel a little better about after last week's debate is that their core supporters are probably with them, and that's why the governor could be a little more flexible about some of the positions that he took in last week's debate. And the president's probably recalibrating after the debate last week, and they're thinking, well, what do we have to do now to make up for the president's not so solid debate performance last week. So they'll track, they're looking at how changing events will affect the course of the campaign. They'll follow that stuff pretty carefully.
What's your sense as to debates in general in presidential campaigns?
Well, most of the time most of the people who watch debates have already formulated their views, and the debates have what we call a reinforcing effect. So if David's watching the debate or Terry Madonna is watching the debate, I'm watching it, and yeah, I like what my candidate said, it reinforces that. It rarely shakes the confidence of people who are pretty strongly committed, and that's most voters. But there is a segment that can be moved, and then there's the immediate aftermath. I mean, what's the impact of it in the news? So historically, we've maybe had two that it really mattered. The Kennedy debate, John Kennedy was about a point or two behind Richard Nixon, but he got up in front of an audience and appeared presidential, here's this junior senator from Massachusetts without a great track record, a show horse, not a workhorse, to use that expression, who got up and stood side by side with the Vice President of the United States on an equal footing. And forget for the moment that Nixon had been ill and he had looked like he hadn't shaved in 2 months and he was a little sweaty. But television's a medium where how you look and style points matter, which was another reason that Romney did as well as he did last week, because of the way he took over the stage and the president was looking down, he appeared unsure. The president looked like he wanted to be anywhere but on that stage, whereas Romney took command physically, not just what he said, with the way in which he approached the whole debate. Kennedy did the same thing. The biggest change, however, was Reagan and Carter. A debate held 10 days before the election. Reagan was behind, and he had been portrayed as not the smartest guy to ever seek the presidency, to put it bluntly. Guy who would end Social Security as we know it. That's what Democrats were saying, and tough stance on the Soviets might lead to a nuclear war. He actually benefited in terms of numbers that it moved, polling numbers, more than any other candidate did in presidential debates. And some believe that he went from behind to ahead and they believe that won it for him. And we've had some debate performances like Al Gore's side during that first debate, and people thought, oh man, this was terrible. And I don't know that, there's no evidence that probably determined the outcome. And there have been other debates where there have been bad performances and great performances that didn't prove to be transformative.
How much of an impact would you guess the vice presidential debates would have?
Typically, almost none. The most celebrated moment in a vice presidential debate occurred when Dan Quayle, a senator from Indiana, was George Herbert Walker Bush's running mate in 1988, and he was running against Lloyd Bentsen, a senior senator from the state of Texas. And Quayle, during the course of the campaign, was running around the country saying, because he didn't have a lot of experience, he's young, I have as much experience as John F. Kennedy did when he ran for the presidency, and I'm just seeking the vice presidency. So he brought that up again in a debate, and Bentsen really jumped on him. He said, well, Senator, I knew John Kennedy. John Kennedy was a friend of mine, and you're no John Kennedy. I mean, it took Tom Brokaw, who was moderating, it seemed like about 2 hours to get the audience, David, to get the audience back, on track. And guess what? Bush and Quayle won. You get it?
Yeah, yeah.
So, but I think what's fascinating about this is two things. First of all, Joe Biden. He's got this reputation of being Joe, saying almost anything at any time. We don't know what he's going to say. So that gives us a bit of fascination. And the other thing is that whether or not Biden, because of the president's performance, comes hard, really hard at Paul Ryan and goes back to Ryan's conservatism, is the budget that's controversial that he had introduced not once but twice into the House, as the top budget, and where that all goes. So I don't think it'll determine the outcome, but I'll tell you, I think we could have a record number of viewers for this debate.
Will there be a challenge to Paul Ryan to track Mitt Romney's somewhat changing course. He became a little bit more moderate in the debate, as I could see.
Great question.
Yeah. Do you think that he'll have to follow that same course, or?
Yeah, I think what Biden will try to do is to present the Ryan plan, the Ryan Medicare plan, which is not, strictly speaking, Romney's plan, and point out that inconsistency. I think he'll go hard at that. Now, the problem with that tactically is Ryan will just simply say, Senator, you voted for the Iraq, you know what I mean? You had these positions, yet you were elected on a different ticket. I have some different positions, but it's Romney's. So I think that would probably be a mistake. I think he does have to go, to your point, to talk more about, that is, Biden has to talk about Romney, not about Ryan. But we could see a mixture of both. And remember, the moderator could push the questioning about Ryan's positions on the budget and on Medicare and see where that all goes. So we could see a little bit of both.
We're going to see some different formats in the debates too, aren't we? How, do you think one would favor anyone either way?
Yeah, I think the president will do better in the town hall format. That's the next format. I tell you, Jim Laird, the moderator from PBS, took a lot of heat, you know, for not getting the debate under control. After about 10 minutes went by, he said, "Your 2 minutes are up," and then he would give him more. I'm exaggerating, but you know the point. I actually liked the debate. I thought it was fun. I liked the back and forth. I think I much prefer that the moderators sit back. So, you know, that he didn't push them. They were doing it themselves, weren't they? Mm-hmm. I actually liked the format. I used to help the League of Women Voters out statewide about a decade ago in their debate. And I always said, let's have a little looser format. I don't, you know, standing up, well, you have 30 seconds and then you get 10 for reply. Let's have fun. I think it's more educational and fun for people watching it, you know, for students get more people engaged. If they let them be themselves, let's see a little bit. I don't want all of these talking points. Get them off the talking points. Mm-hmm.
Are there any polls that, and we won't name them, of course, but is there any polling that gets news now that you find cringeworthy? In other words, is all of it subject to a verification or a level of assurance that you feel comfortable with? Yeah,
I mean, I'm always skeptical of any poll produced by a party or for a candidate. Here's why. If it were bad news, would they release it? And I noticed that sometimes, even when a candidate's behind, they never quite seem to be as far behind on a candidate-paid poll, you see where I'm heading with this, as they would in the public polls. Do they have a right to do it? Yep. Would I deny them that right? Of course not. But I'm a little skeptical. The other thing I would say to the viewers is that I'm a big believer in polling averages. Like, there are aggregators that have all the polls and you can look at averages. Real Clear Politics is one. Mystery Pollster is another. Nate Silver at the 538 blog, you know, New York Times is a good one. I like to look at averages because any poll can have its problems on any given day. It's just the nature of probability sampling, the nature of interviewing with fewer and fewer people willing to talk to pollsters, so that leads to low response rates, to the necessity to statistically adjust the poll that we call weighting, when you have certain groups of people that are underrepresented or overrepresented because of the nature of trying to reach voters, and who will, you know, who will talk to you. So but I think most of the network polls pretty good. You know, most of the polls produced for major media outlets done by colleges and universities are pretty good.
Did you ever anticipate that the Keystone Poll, when you started it, would become the Franklin Marshall Poll, of course, and then as involved as it is now in Pennsylvania?
No, when I started, there was only a poll out and done by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called the Pennsylvania Poll, which I loved that name, so I had to take Keystone, you know, Keystone, and then they went out of business. They stopped polling in PA, maybe 8 or 9 years after of the 21 that I've been doing this. And now there's 7 or 8 polls done. A lot of people come in and do polls. You don't have to be here to do them. That's not the problem. I think one of our strengths is the fact that we live here, we study the politics, we write about Pennsylvania politics incessantly, both, you know, in our academic research as well as our current political polling, which means I hope that gives us an understanding of the data that we have that helps us to explain it a little more. But a lot of the polls are very good, but there's 7 or 8, and they're, you know, in a sense we compete but don't for the attention of people. I'm delighted that I've had, when I started I had 2 partners, KYW down here in Philly and the Philly Daily News, and I'm delighted that I have 8 media partners that trust and have confidence in the work that we do. And that they continue to use our poll.
In some aspects, you get students involved in your polling as well, don't you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we have a paid staff of people because the Center for Opinion Research at F&M that actually does the polling also does lots of research for health care, for hospitals. In other words, it's an ongoing research operation. The poll just gets dropped in for, what, 15 weeks out of the year. So they get to do that work, and we do have students who work there. Now, when I started it, it was basically done by students in government classes. Basically done all by students. Wow. Now, if we have 60 interviewers, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you know, of them are students. The good thing now is they get paid. They're not doing it as a class project.
Every month, you're generating a different poll, and I noticed, just for example, it looked to be about maybe 600 different interviews of people.
Yeah, we'll do, the number of interviews will vary. You probably ought to be getting up to about 6 or 7. Here's the key to this. You can do a statewide poll of 400 or 450 voters. And, you know, that might have a sample error plus or minus, let's say 5%, just for the percentage point. But what happens if I want to look at how people are doing in Philadelphia, or how the candidates are doing in the 4 suburban counties? The number of people we would interview there with 450 would be too small to make reasonable generalizations. So the more interviews you can do, the more reliable and statistically relevant would be the information you get from those regions. And the same would be, maybe not for males and females, because, you know, what, 52, let's say, 52, 47, but what if I want to know what Catholics who earn over $50,000 a year who live in Philadelphia think about this election? So you need to do a lot more interviews. So it matters for that, not so much just for who's winning the state.
Well, I wonder if I could draw your attention to Pennsylvania itself. I noticed also on last month's poll some very interesting statewide issues. The one that caught my eye was, well, a couple things caught my eye. One was, and it reminded me of one of the TV personalities being more recognized than a number of the Republican candidates. In Pennsylvania, Tom Smith is unknown, the person running for Attorney General is unknown, according to the poll, by more than 50% of the voters.
It takes maybe $5 million to get any statewide net rating. We have a huge state. We have 6 television markets. And culturally, we're very different. So that means people in Philly are more culturally akin to people who live in Baltimore and Washington and New York than to Pittsburgh, even though they're both big cities. Pittsburgh, more of a Midwest, culturally identified with southeastern Ohio and West Virginia. Ethnically different, in religious terms, in views and attitudes different. And then you got the mid-state, which has a whole other different demographic, different majority religions different. So Pennsylvania is a big, complicated state. So to get known in it, you just can't go and do a couple of press conferences with newspapers, you know, and editorial boards. Although, I mean, you've got to spend millions of dollars on television advertising in order to get any statewide name recognition. So look, if you're an anchor on a Philadelphia TV station and you're doing the news, you reach 40% of the voters of the state in that one TV program. And imagine if you're somebody like Jim Gardner, the dean of Philadelphia, I think not arguably, the dean of Philadelphia TV journalists, right? He reaches 40% of the voters of the state in theory, and I'm not saying they're all watching, every time he does a newscast. I mean, imagine that reach. So imagine what you would have to do if you're Tom Smith, a candidate for office from Armstrong County in western PA, never having run before. The biggest job you held was a township supervisor in Armstrong County. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying the job is, gee, am I not going to have to spend in, let's take the last U.S. Senate race. Now let's skip the last and go back to Casey because he's up for re-election this year, Senator Casey. He spent $17 million. Rick Santorum spent $24 million. And Casey still wasn't as well known as Santorum, who had after all been seeking his third term to the United States Senate. So it costs a lot of money. This is a big state, and people who run statewide, once they do it, will realize how big the state really is.
Interesting issue coming up with respect to the Sandusky Scandal, as I can see it.
Right.
I guess incumbent governors especially always have quite a strong leg up.
Correct.
Looks from your polling results that the Sandusky Scandal is on many people's minds. And what sort of factor do you think it'll be in re-election campaign?
That's a great question, and it potentially is a serious problem. I mean, look, here's the reason. Most voters think that it wasn't handled well. Most voters don't like particularly the sanctions that Penn State got, the taking away the winning seasons all the years, which not arguably hurt players and students, and the university. It had nothing to do with this scandal. So there's a lot of unhappy people about the sanctions in the polls that I did, and just anecdotally. But here's the bigger problem going forward for Governor Corbett. We're going to have the remainder of the civil cases adjudicated. News, 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 news. We could have, both candidates for Attorney General have pledged a review of the investigation. But if the Democrat wins, Kathleen Kane, she has said that on the record before a Scranton newspaper, she said Corbett probably played politics with the investigation. She said that on the record. Now, if she wins, where do you think that leads everything? You think she's going to go in there and just sit on this? She criticized him for calling the grand jury, and she said dragging it out. Now, there's two sides to this. Some will say, well, the governor, when he was Attorney General, had to get the case together, and sexual abuse cases are very hard, and witnesses, you got to deal, and it took a long time. But make no mistake about it, if we get a Democratic Attorney General, you better believe it's going to be in the news, for the next year and a half, and and that is not likely to help Governor Corbett in his re-election effort.
I'd like to talk to you forever, but they won't let me. But
I understand.
Let me do my sign-off if I may. Dr. Madonna, thank you very much for joining. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society Perspectives series on CCPTV, the educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. For more information about CCP or the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society, please contact us at the college. I'm David Freeman, Associate Professor in the Department of Social Sciences. See you next time.